The Taliban announced 1 year ago that it fulfilled an obligation of jihad and liberated Afghanistan. We look at how this group of fighters turned into government officials overnight and what they have done to the country. I'm Her Afghanistan, and today's newsmaker is Afghanistan under Taliban rule. For many, the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan is marked on August 15, 2021, the day the Taliban overthrew the government of Ashraf Ghani and seized power. Since then, a number of international initiatives in the country have crumbled. According to the Human Rights Watch, the economy has collapsed as the Taliban shuns most international financial institutions. An ongoing food crisis has yet to be turned around, with half the population going hungry and, most notably, the rights of women and girls have been rolled back as they are blocked from education, jobs, and freedom of movement. But remember, none of this is why U.S. President George W. Bush sent his troops into Afghanistan 20 years ago. Instead, it was to wage a war on terrorism that targeted Al-Qaeda and the government, giving the group safe haven. With the goal in mind, America's defeat in the region may not have been last year, but actually a couple of weeks ago, when the U.S. military fired 2 Hellfire missiles into Kabul. They killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, who at one point was Osama bin Laden's personal physician. And sure, for U.S. President Joe Biden, this was a face-saving military victory, a much-needed one after what many called a disastrous withdrawal of U.S. troops. But it is also a clear indication that America's biggest objective in Afghanistan failed spectacularly. While the Taliban deny being complicit, some in Kabul, as they had done during the 9/11 attacks, seem to be assisting America's enemies. And the U.S. Secretary of State expressed his displeasure with this statement. He said, quote, "By hosting and sheltering the leader of Al-Qaeda in Kabul, the Taliban grossly violated the Doha Agreement and repeated assurances to the world that they would not allow Afghan territory to be used by terrorists to threaten the security of other countries." And while Washington has been on the back foot during this past year, it can still back up its threats, not just with more drone strikes, but financial retaliation. The U.S. currently holds billions of dollars in Afghan reserves, and if Taliban leaders want that money, and they do, they might need a different relationship with their former occupiers. For the White House, a good place to start is with the 16-year-old girl's request.
My message to the Taliban is to reopen schools for girls as soon as possible. I urge them to keep their word, and I request the international community to pressurize the Taliban to reopen our schools. We want to study.
So, 1 year out, will Afghanistan continue down a road heading to a failed state, or can it turn things around? Joining me now to discuss this is Mariam Wardak. She's the founder of Her Afghanistan, an organization that advocates for Afghan women. Michael Kugelman joins me from Annapolis, Maryland. He is a South Asia expert at the Wilson Center. And in Islamabad is Imtiaz Gul, the executive director of the Center for Research and Security Studies. Thanks all for being with us today here on The Newsmakers. Now, we just listed a whole host of issues that the Taliban is currently facing. Mariam, let me begin by asking you, how much of these problems did the Taliban inherit from the government they overthrew, the government of Ashraf Ghani?
Well, I think that first we need to focus on how these issues were mostly placed on the Taliban due to the lack of responsibility from the international community. We have to also understand that the Taliban is shifting from a jihadist insurgency to a ruling governance party, and that is not an easy aspect. Moving forward, this is why what the Taliban had made an announcement for technocrats and other educated individuals to stay in the government or to return to the country to work within government. I know many young individuals who would never have sympathized or even agree with the Taliban mentality. They work with the government to help the country prosper.
Okay. Michael, let me come to you. Now, according to many, the problems that the Taliban inherited from the government of Ashraf Ghani have only gotten worse since 15th of August 2021. Tell me, how much blame belongs to Ashraf Ghani for this?
Well, I mean, one could certainly blame Ashraf Ghani for essentially fleeing the country at the moment when his country needed him the most, 1 year ago, August 15. But I think that, looking at what the Taliban regime inherited from the Ghani government, certainly the big challenge now is the economic crisis. And Afghanistan was not in an economically stable place before the Taliban takeover. However, I would argue that when the Taliban came to power, it was the international sanctions regime on the Taliban leadership that really worsened this economic crisis so much, just because Afghanistan had been so heavily dependent on international support for so long. When the Taliban took over, then all of this international assistance really stopped, and all that has come into Afghanistan over the last year has been humanitarian assistance, and that's because of the international sanctions regime. So I guess blame can be deposited on many doorsteps, but I think it is important to remember that indeed Afghanistan was not economically stable by any means before the Taliban took over. But the Taliban has been in a position where it's really can't do all that much at all. It's been able to generate revenue through customs tariffs and so on, but it lacks the ability to manage such a huge policy catastrophe, such as what it's dealing with.
Okay, and you're right. Afghanistan was not in perfect shape when it comes to economy, but since the Taliban took over the country last year in August, the economy of the country contracted by an estimated 30 to 40%. That is according to the United Nations. Imtiaz, let me come to you now. Is that contraction caused by the ineffectiveness of the Taliban when it comes to governance, or perhaps the ignorance of the international community?
I would say both. This is the contraction was bound to come once the international forces, including those of the United States, abruptly left the country. And secondly, we have to keep in mind this is a cumulative impact of the last 4 decades of continuous war, and particularly the last 20 years when the United States and other international players, big players, basically ignored the bad governance, the lack of transparency, lack of accountability within the Hamid Karzai as well as Ashraf Ghani administration. They simply looked the other way as things were getting from bad to worse on ground. And then the Taliban obviously have inherited a number of problems from there. But I guess we should give credit to the Taliban that they have prevented an implosion the way everybody had forecast. It was predicted they may not last beyond six months, but it has happened on the contrary. They have increased their revenues. They have curtailed to a great extent corruption within the government systems. And most importantly, the dollar-denominated top governance structures are gone. So a lot of brain drain has taken place. Hundreds of thousands of technocrats have left the country. So it's like a cost-effective governance model that is currently in place.
Okay, now I want to talk about the U.S. here. Certainly the U.S., perhaps many would say the U.S. is still a key stakeholder in Afghanistan. Now, not long ago, the U.S. President Joe Biden was asked about the situation in Afghanistan. Let's listen to what he said, and then we will continue.
Had we not gotten out, and the acknowledgement is we'd be putting a lot more forces in. Now, do I feel badly what's happening as a consequence of the incompetence of the Taliban? Yes, I do. But I feel badly also about the fistulas that are taking place in Eastern Congo. I feel badly about a whole range of things around the world that we can't solve every problem.
Michael, what do you make of this attitude? I understand President Biden cannot solve all problems in this world right now, but come on, the U.S. was directly involved in Afghanistan. It occupied the country for 20 years. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it's true that a fair criticism of the Biden administration has been this the sense that it's trying to distance itself in terms of policy, but also emotionally from Afghanistan. And that criticism was there during those terrible, chaotic last 2 weeks of the U.S. withdrawal, when administration officials really were not acknowledging all the terrible things and suffering happening in Afghanistan at that time. And I think this gets to a broader point, to a broader strategic point, that while the U.S. is still committed to doing what it can to ease the humanitarian crisis, and of course, as we saw in recent weeks, it's trying to pursue its counterterrorism interests in Afghanistan. For the most part, the Biden administration has moved on from Afghanistan, and Biden himself has been very clear on that, and saying that he wanted to leave Afghanistan because there's bigger foreign policy priorities for the U.S. to deal with, such as the competition with China and climate change issues and so on. I think he was being very honest about that. But this is certainly very troubling for sure, in that, as I said before, one of the big reasons why Afghans are going through so much now is this sanctions regime, which, of course, the U.S. had put in place some years ago. Now, for sure, if the Taliban were not doing the types of things that led those sanctions to be imposed on them, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So the Taliban certainly deserve the blame here as well. But I think it's very troubling that the U.S. appears to be engaged in this distancing process, where its interests in Afghanistan have narrowed, and its foreign policy priorities are very limited in Afghanistan right now. And that does not include, really thinking through in a broader way an Afghanistan policy that can do more to help a country and people that really need assistance, and particularly from one of the wealthiest countries in the world and one of the biggest bilateral donors in the world.
Okay, now, Mariam, the U.S. has also frozen almost $7 billion in Afghan assets. Tell me, what do you make of that kind of a strategy?
Well, aside from freezing it, they're trying to allocate half of that to the victims of 9/11. I think that it's bizarre on how the U.S. is approaching and politically I can't conjure the type of actions that they're taking forward towards Afghanistan. First, the war on terrorism, and now completely cutting off Afghans for the rightful funds that is theirs. It is irresponsible to the highest level possible, but more so the whole international community's bizarrely incoherent approach, even now, on how they are interacting with the Taliban, has huge ramifications on the Afghans. What I'm trying, for example, when you have the United States indirectly speaking with the Taliban and not directly speaking with the Taliban and not recognizing them, when you're communicating with a party, you are recognizing them. So this political not recognition, communication, and slogan that they have going forward, a campaign, it doesn't make any sense, because it's not helping the Afghan people.
So tell me, what would make sense? What would make sense for you?
Well, for instance, when you're allowing only NGOs for like the UN to help the Afghan people, you are again causing the Afghans to fall into a beggar's routine. This is what happened when they pulled out after Russia was dismantled by Afghans, and they are doing it now when they pulled out after helping Afghanistan themselves. They need to empower the local NGOs and the Afghans, providing them with assistance that's needed. This does not mean inflate Afghanistan with huge cash flows, but helping them with the right sectors that is needed. That is agriculture, that is water, that is providing assistance with certain businesses. USAID was one of the largest donors to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan can easily create cotton, but because US is one of the cotton distributors, they wouldn't allow Afghans to create cotton. So there's so many issues on hands, and a polarized approach in Afghanistan. It really damaged Afghans and the well-being of Afghanistan.
Okay. Okay. Now, Imtiaz, I will come to you. And Michael, you mentioned counter-terrorism operations in your response to my question earlier. Now, one of the main reasons why the U.S. invaded Afghanistan was to fight al-Qaeda. I mean, it's been more than 20 years now. Tell me, has the U.S.'s fight against al-Qaeda or the U.S.'s war on terrorism been successful in your view?
There's no group in Afghanistan at this point in time, in my view, that has the ability to plan and carry out an attack on U.S. soil but certainly more broadly, indeed, absolutely. The Al-Qaeda affiliates and also the affiliates, the regional affiliates of Islamic State, have become stronger than the parent organizations themselves, and those still pose threats. And of course, in Afghanistan itself, you have relentless, I mean, you have the relentless threat of terrorism, mainly perpetrated by Islamic State. And of course, Islamic State did not exist until U.S. forces entered Afghanistan. So that's a failure right there. That even under the nose of U.S. troops, so to speak, a new terror group emerged in Afghanistan. But I would argue, I mean, to be very brief, that the U.S. entered Afghanistan to ensure that Afghanistan would never again be used by any group to threaten the United States or U.S. soil. And for now, at least, it's been successful in that the groups that are present there now don't have that capacity. I say that now, though.
Okay. Imtiaz, let me come to you now. Let me get your thoughts on this.
Well, I think first we have to keep in mind that the point that Michael made, this U.S. disengagement from Afghanistan, I think the Undersecretary of State for Undersecretary for Planning at Pentagon recently made it very clear that this cold-blooded review of Afghanistan policy happened because of the threat number one, and that is China. So never before had a Pentagon official so categorically stated that. Secondly, I just read over the net that that Biden administration has basically decided not to release the $7 billion being held in the United States because of the al-Zawahiri's killing and the questionable conduct of the Taliban on the issue of counterterrorism. So I would say that while the U.S. will continue to engage with the Taliban, I think it's now very much clear that their reluctance in conclusively going after all those terrorist groups that pose threat to regional countries, including the TTP, that is an enemy for Pakistan, ETIM, that is an enemy for China, and of course the IMU that represents threats to the Central Asian republics and by implication Russia, that they are not taking any action against them. And this will, I think, continue to pose a big problem for any negotiations with the Taliban.
Now, Imtiaz, you mentioned the killing of al-Zawahiri. Now, I understand the U.S. has accused the Taliban of providing safe haven to al-Zawahiri, and according to many reports, it appears that the ruling Taliban were aware of and gave their blessing to al-Zawahiri staying in one of the residential places in Kabul. But tell me, is it possible that someone in the hierarchy of the Taliban turned him into the U.S.?
Well, I mean, you can't rule that out because he was living in a very heavily fortified, guarded place, and there were a few people taking care of them. You know, it's a very exclusive area. So it's quite possible that somebody may have provided cues to that or but you cannot really say this for sure. However, it can't be ruled out either.
Okay. Mariam, let me come to you now. Of course, we are speculating right now, but if it is true that there is some sort of disagreement among the Taliban, they do not unite on a lot of, on many pressing issues, what does it tell us about their future as a group? Do you think they have the power at this point to unite the country?
I think that we need to take one step back and really reflect leadership of the Taliban. They have never united. There's a mullah brother, and then there's the Sirajuddin Haqqani camp. And one of the main evidences was when the girls were about to third, and all of a sudden, the day of, they were retracted from attending to school. And when you speak to the Taliban that are in leadership in the government, none of them had an idea of why this action was taken, because many of them were progressive and wanted girls to attend school. However, the decree came from Kandahar. Now, I want to take one step back, Jafar, on the question that you had asked regarding U.S. holding, when Imtiaz Ali said that U.S. would hold $7 billion of funds. When bin Laden was found in Pakistan, I did not see any actions of U.S. decreasing any type of assistance that they were providing to Pakistan, but continues to call them a strategic ally. We also have to reflect at the fact that the Taliban are in Afghanistan in this position because of the morale boost that the United States had provided to the Taliban in their engagement led by Mike Pompeo. So these contradictory actions are leaving Afghanistan to be a play or ploy or an act of war actions, political plays, and for regional and international action. Now, the Taliban have never made decisions on their own. We have been well informed that Saudi, Pakistan have always had a major influence on which direction the Taliban have led. But my interest is on the Taliban that are in Afghanistan, and specifically those who are in power in the government. Many of them per se, journalists and others, see that they are taking a more progressive step and they want a prosperous country. But being stringed along by other countries, obviously Afghanistan is not going to move.
Okay. Now, Imtiaz, according to Mariam, Pakistan has played a pivotal role in deciding where the Taliban is heading towards. Is that true?
Well, I think this boogie somehow needs to come to an end. All these years, there was certain number of people, certain lobbies which thrived and prospered on their anti-Pakistanism, that they would connect everything to Pakistan. And Pakistan, if Pakistan had this much leverage, then I think it wouldn't have a volatile northwestern border regions where the security forces are getting killed every day. So I think somehow we have to move on and think of what the Afghans themselves can do to their own country.
Okay, I mean, we're in the dying minutes of the program, and I still have to talk about the resistance that the Taliban is facing from within the countries. For example, there is a presence of anti-Taliban forces such as the National Resistance Front and the Afghanistan Freedom Front. Michael, is it likely for Afghanistan to head towards a civil war? Or do you think the Taliban has the capacity and the capability to continue resisting these groups?
I think that 1 year on, the Taliban have no viable opposition. Indeed, there is these pockets of armed resistance, and specifically the National Resistance Front, based in the Panjshir region. But this is a group that doesn't really have much capacity to do much damage. Most of its leaders are outside of Afghanistan, and the few times when there have been some offensives waged by the NRF, they've been brutally suppressed by the Taliban. And of course, the other main foe is ISIS, Islamic State Khorasan. Most of ISK's attacks over the last year in Afghanistan have targeted the Taliban directly. But this is a terror group. It doesn't have the capacity to actually overthrow the Taliban, so to speak. But certainly, ISK, as I said before, is the most potent, active, dangerous terror group in Afghanistan today. And the fact that it's the only terror group in Afghanistan that does not have any type of links to the Taliban, that's troubling for the Taliban. But the Taliban is in full control. And I don't think there's any reason to think that the war, which has ended, will resume anytime soon. However, if the Taliban continue to struggle with these policy challenges that they have over the last year, particularly the economic crisis, if their internal divisions continue to get worse and puts more stress on them, that could provide some openings for a new armed resistance to emerge. But I don't think we're talking about that happening anytime in the immediate term. So bottom line, despite all its struggles and despite its challenges, the Taliban remains in firm control, and I don't really see that control being challenged in a big way anytime soon.
Okay, Mariam, this is going to be my last question of the program. As Michael said, Taliban are the de facto leader in the country right now, and in the near future, it seems unlikely to be changed. So tell me, what do you want the Taliban to do for Afghanistan at this point? Be very precise, though.
I think the Taliban need to allow women in the public sphere. Now, in the public sphere, I mean incorporate them in the government structure. I think the Taliban, what we've noticed in the past few days, don't really have a vested interest in trying to crack down on clothing or trying to resurrect the most vaunted and notorious vice and virtue policy. Lately, I've noticed that the Taliban have been mentioning that the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, they're going to open a women's affairs office. And this is something that we, the international community, really need to keep an eye on. allowing young girls to go to school. I know 9 provinces have allowed women to go to school up until high school, and I know the capital is allowing young girls to continue their education in university. But there is a national interest campaign that I want and change the mentality of the people.
Okay.
We also, one thing I want to mention is that we have to understand that the Taliban are not the only restricted group in Afghanistan. There are very traditional aspects throughout the country that are a tribal approach and not allowing some women to attend the public sector. So having a more Islamic campaign on what are the best interests in Afghan girls attending the public sphere will be the best approach.
I mean, this is such an important topic, and it certainly requires a longer discussion, but unfortunately, we are out of time. Mariam, Michael, Imtiaz, thanks very much all for talking to us here on The Newsmakers, and thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Her Afghanistan. See you next time.